So, buenos dias, good morning, everybody. As Andres mentioned, I'm Dr. Sally Guzman. I'm the Family and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Edmonds School District. And as a part of my job, I do equity trainings through the district. I'm going to share my screen if it lets me. Oops, hold on. Yay. Okay. And I am going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So keep that in mind that you might be asked to put like responses in the chat and stuff. So the title is Understanding Bias as a Latina in the United States. And I wanted to give that explicit title because when you're doing equity trainings, you really do have to consider your audience. And our experiences are going to differ based on a lot of things, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but hopefully I'm able to touch on that topic. I'm combining a few presentations for this. Why didn't it let me click off? I'm assuming you already did a land acknowledgement for today. No. So in the Edmonds School District, we do land acknowledgements at the beginning of our meetings. So I want to acknowledge the inhabitants of this land that I stand on, which is the Edmonds School District, and which is the Sahobish peoples, and their successors, the Tulalip tribes, who since time immemorial have taken care of, hunted, fished, gathered on these lands. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and we honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. By acknowledging these homelands, we are also committing to working with tribal nations to further the educational aims that have identified in our classroom and in our schools. We do this land acknowledgement to center ourselves and understand that as a school district, our impact on Indigenous communities is every day, right? And we have work that we need to do. We also have this month, we acknowledge that it's Black Lives Matter month of action. And the Edmonds School District has policies in place to hopefully help us as a system begin to become anti-racist and undo some of the systemic issues that are in our systems, whether we want to acknowledge them or not, kind of a scenario, right? So some of the training that I'm doing here today, we actually do with all staff members as they become new employees. So as I go through this, I'll share a little bit about why we do learn certain things as well, because I feel like that active learning is a little bit more where you are at versus when I'm doing a training for someone when these conversations are very new to them and they don't have, they haven't acknowledged and or been aware of their own direct personal experience with these topics. I will send this PowerPoint to Letty when I'm done, and if you want to learn more about me, I have my information there. I won't bore you about it. So some norms today. These are borrowed from Courageous Conversations, which is a really great book if you're into reading books on how to navigate these conversations. As a person of color, I've found that I really need to be centered in my why, so that I have the patience and what is it when you're like the grace. I give people grace as I lead these trainings. Because I am in an institution that is predominantly white. So there is a high chance that I will have negative experiences even while I'm doing the training. And so the ones that we do is stay engaged. So, like I said, please make sure you're focused on this conversation. And, whether that means in person closing your laptop or, taking notes, whatever that means for you. We're going to experience discomfort. So when we are learning something new or something is different than what we believe, we end up going into what educators call a learning pit. And that means you're actually growing as a learner. And so when we're talking about these topics, I'm hopefully pushing you to grow. So there might be times when you're uncomfortable. We'll talk a little bit about how we work with that. We're going to speak our truth. So we're going to make I statements. I mean, that's critical and helpful to us, right? Because oftentimes we're asked to speak for our whole community, which is not feasibly possible. Expect and accept non-closure. I want to make sure you understand that this is like 45 minutes. I'm hopefully not going to talk for all 45 minutes. And so therefore, I'm not going to give you the full theological explanation of everything, right? It's pedagogy. I'm just going to skim a few topics for you. So I talked a little bit about experiencing discomfort. This is called an amygdala hijack. Does everyone who has their camera on want to show me where they think their amygdala is on their brain? Yes. So it's right here in the base of your brain. It was one of the first parts of our brains that evolved. And originally it's what kept us alive because it controlled our fight, freeze, appease response to threats. As we are now in a world where we're not looking at bears and other creatures that can eat us every day, our amygdala is starting to also come up when we're either pushed on our cultural norms. So our belief system can be pushed, and then we're going to have trembling hands, butterflies, the same kind of either I want to get out of the room, I want to freeze and stop thinking, right? And so it can also make you combative. So we want to be aware of those things because when we're doing these trainings, we're saying that we want to grow as a person. So we do what's called hijack preparedness before all of our trainings. And what we want to say is when you see that behavior in yourself, the nervousness or whatever, we want you to kind of stop what you're doing, if you're taking notes or whatever, observe what caused this reaction, and then detach. Detach is very much person to person. So some people do box breathing, some people get up and like wiggle a little, some people just drink some water to take that pause, right? And the whole point of that is that you're separating yourself from your amygdala and you're trying to, re-engage your prefrontal cortex and awaken and come back into the learning. And so on the, what would be, I guess you're right, you're going to see the culture tree. Can you guys show me with a raise of hands, either physically or with the Zoom feature, how many of you know what the cultural tree is or the cultural iceberg? Okay. Okay. All right. So the cultural tree or iceberg is this concept of understanding that culture can be at various different levels. So in an iceberg, they say that 90% of the iceberg is underwater. So while you see this much of it, the truth is culture goes beyond that. The tree is kind of a similar concept created by Dr. Zaretta Hammond. And what the culture tree is saying is the leaves are the surface cultures. So the colors you choose to wear, the glasses, the jewelry, the music you might be playing, the food you might be eating, things that are easily visible to others, those are surface cultures. And sometimes people think that that's the only part of culture. And then you have shallow culture, and shallow culture has other things that hold on, let me pull it up on a different screen so that I'm remembering everything because let me see if I can get the right one up on you for you. Oh, here is my cultural tree. Okay, let's see if it'll. So here's the kind of and I'll put this in this slide, the cultural tree. So songs, music, right? And shallow culture is like concepts of time, right? So that's something that have varying degrees, eye contact, whether that's normal or not normal, or when it's normal and when it's not normal. And then nonverbal communication, principles of child rearing, those are all shallow culture, which means people can interact with those parts of your belief system, but it's not like, as you're walking past them in a grocery store kind of a scenario. And then more deeper roots, so the things that are very anchored into our culture, can be decision making, worldviews, definition of kinship, which I think is a huge differentiation for some Latinx people and non-Latinx people, but there's other communities. So this anthropological term of what is it? Not fake kinship, but so kinship, right? In the definition. So I was in college when I realized that what second cousin means, because to us, everybody is they're your cousin or they're a friend or they're an auntie, but there's no this like second cousin. And like I used to hear it a lot, like, oh, is that your second cousin twice removed? And like in my, I was brought here when I was 5 years old. There was a lot of cultural context I didn't have. I was like, how do you remove cousins? Like, and why do you remove them? And it wasn't until I was in an anthropology class, like many years later, that I was like, oh, it has to do with this like cultural anthropological way of documenting who's kin to who and how. And so those concepts are very much rooted in who we are. And what I like to think about is that those deep roots are connected to shallow culture and are also connected to our leaves, right? So therefore, sometimes we don't realize that when someone is pushing on a belief that feels like it's shallow and according to theory should have less of an impact, what some people don't realize is they're actually triggering a deep culture belief, and then therefore you're going to push on that belief and be upset. Let me escape out of this presentation. Oh, there you go. Wrong one. So that's kind of why we talk about the tree and ensuring that we understand it so that we know when and how it can present itself. So some learning objectives is definitions, acknowledging our own biases and how they impact practices, and then awareness of ability to explore identity, race, and culture, and then learning how identity becomes more, how our own identities and how to become more culturally aware. So as you go out and do this work in the community, it's really important to take a humbling perspective. Sometimes we're in different parts of this cultural competency continuum and call it culturally responsive practices. I am not a person who feels like some words need to be as debated as they are. But at least what I found in education when I was younger and in society is a lot of this forced assimilation. Telling me what's wrong with me or why the things that I'm doing are inappropriate. And so where we're trying to get to is the other end of that, which is where we're looking at changes and modalities and thinking about people and how to evolve and accept things, like a simple concept of don't yuck other people's yum, right? Like telling little kids to respect, that someone else might be eating something that you're like, but what do you gain in saying yuck when someone else enjoys it, right? They're not forcing you to eat it. So I get a little frazzled and sometimes I forget to share my pronouns, but hopefully I remember my pronouns are she, her, ella. And I share pronouns and I talk about pronouns as a form of allyship, both to my students and to, of course, my community at large, to understand why we use them, right? We use them a lot because they replace names in sentences, and it can be very hard to use a person's name in every sentence. So as an example, I'm Sally. Sally went to the market. More likely you're to use, because my pronouns are she, her, is she went to the market. So that's why we feel providing space for pronouns is so critical. You'll notice that it's in my name. I put it into parentheses. I also have it in my email, and I actually have started to try to use it both in email introductions for people and in personal introductions for people. This has really helped me because I feel sometimes I make assumptions. And then, as an educator, we are actually required to respect our students' name and pronouns regardless of our own beliefs. So modeling that for my colleagues is critical. All right, so biases. How many of you feel like you have a definition of bias? Go ahead and, this is just about bias. Go ahead and put it into the chat for me if you have one.
Can I explain in Spanish?
Sí.
Ok, prejuicio es una idea preconcebida de algo o de alguien o de su entorno.
Yes. Preconceived notions about something or someone internally. So why do we have biases? Again, evolution. It was a good survival skill to know when certain types of things were going to be harmful to our existence. So our brains are naturally programmed to categorize and organize all the information that we're receiving from birth. It's why we end up knowing like who's safe in our family, right? Some babies have preferences. All of those are through categorization that naturally occurs in one's brain, which is why I always like to remind everyone that everyone has biases and everyone needs to learn how to understand their biases. And they're also personal, so they're based on your experience, observation, objects, places, events, and people. So that means your culture plays a lot into your categorization in your brain, either through overt messaging or, as I always as a parent, I have an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old, kids always do what you do, not what you say. And the reason for that is that brain categorization. You're saying this, but they're seeing that, so the brain is more likely to do that. That's true for every single quirk that you and or the people around them have as they're growing up. They're internalizing all of these things. So that's where unconscious bias comes from. They're a product of learned associations. They're mental shortcuts, whether they're positive or negative. They are automatic, and under stress, they'll show up even more. And the attitudes in those unconscious bias, they may not show up, and you would never maybe say something or do something in your consciousness, right? So that's why it's so critical to do this individual work and understand yourself better, because you might unwittingly be doing something to someone. So that's the definition. A prejudice is a favor against one thing, person, or group, right? What we said earlier. So in education, we really like to point out the different types of biases. So we have explicit bias, implicit bias, and then group affinity bias. We don't focus a lot on explicit bias. And the reason is because in this work, you cannot be overtly racist. um, and hopefully we're pushing on each other if we do say something and say, hey, let's talk about that. Let's think about what that statement is saying. Because explicit bias does not have a place in our classroom. And our hope is that we're working as an institution to get rid of explicit bias, because that creates an environment not conducive to learning. But implicit bias, so the unconscious attitudes are a lot harder to keep and understand. And so that's the ones we really want to focus on to help ensure that we're actually addressing racism. Before I jump into this, how many of you feel you have a strong definition of institutionalized racism and historical context of that racism in the US? If you could either put yes in the chat or hand up or thumbs up. And I'm almost getting to the point of breakout groups. Thank you. I have a few, so I'm going to go over this real quick. So if whoever can do breakout rooms, if I could get breakout rooms of 3, get it ready for 10 minutes, in about five minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna go over this because I feel like if we don't have this historical context, we miss some critical information. I'm gonna bring this one back in. Okay. So one of the things that I like to point out is the historical context of 1492, when Columbus ran into the Bahamas, brought in colonization, and the impacts of that colonization are still seen until today. So one of the biggest impacts of colonization is the colonizers' inability to keep or want to have or co-create with indigenous people. And their theory when they came here is that, in their terms, the indigenous people were savages. Therefore, they had a right to try to kill them. They had a right to take their land. They had a right to do all of this harm to these people because they were less than human. This concept of dehumanization can still be found today in the way we sometimes speak about other people, whether that be, what happened during COVID and our dehumanization of the Asian Americans and blaming them for a virus that we were all having trouble grasping and controlling and understanding. That led to hatred against the Asian community. 9/11 led to harassment and dehumanization of the Arab American community, Middle Eastern community. So the concept is not new and the concept is not gone. And then that led to what we really focus on in education is residential schools. So the US literally has documents that say, kill the Indian, save the man. And the way in which they indoctrinated this was they created residential schoolings, and they took 5-year-olds from their home of all indigenous people in the United States and in Canada, and they placed them in a boarding school. In those boarding schools, children were robbed of their language, their culture, their community, because they weren't allowed to see their families. And they did so until the child turned 18. So think about being 5 or having a 5-year-old in your life taken from you and being told that you need to place them into this school until the day they turn 18, and that they weren't going to be able to practice their language. They weren't going to be able to wear what they wanted to wear. They weren't going to be able to practice their culture. This went on until 1972. So for those of you doing some math, that means that most of the Generation X of today could have either been in a residential schooling, Generation X or older, or been the child of someone who was in a residential school. Once those residential schools closed, they actually did congressional hearings, and it was proven that there was an obscene amount of both physical, mental, and sexual abuse. In Canada, where they have done reconciliation committees, which were recently done, and their boarding schools ended in 1992, which is a critical concept for the Pacific Northwest, because of those of you who are observing the map of the Coast Salish nations, which is the ones that we have, the community that lives here, they were actually placed in boarding schools either in the US or in Canada. So some people actually were impacted in our area with residential schooling until 1992. So in the reconciliation that they're doing in Canada, they're putting sonar, ground penetrating sonar, and they're finding thousands of mass graves of children who were murdered during this time. So it's critical to understand that when I analyze education, I see that impact and how that impact might impact how I'm working with someone today. And as a Latino, I feel like one of the things we generalize is not understanding the same thing happened in our countries. So I'm indigenous to Peru. I'm from a little tiny village in Ancash, and I never realized that we were indigenous. Like, it makes sense when you think about it, like this tiny rural village, there's not like a ton of like, you know, movement of, it's not a commerce location, right? And but yet no one knows what our indigenous language is or what our indigenous community was, because we were so colonized and so enculturated forcibly into colonialism of Espanol, we call Castellano in our village, and Christianity, and all of those essence that we've lost who we are, and with very little ways of collecting it back. It's different when in Cusco and in other parts of Peru, they still have their indigenous roots and have that community and that cultural was passed on. While in South America, we had maybe more colonization of our communities. We actually are more indigenous than we ever admit to. This is very true of most Latina cultures and communities. And so I always ask people, ask your families, because you will be surprised just how little to how much as actually, because my family is always like, oh, no, we're all these things. I'm 70% indigenous. So there was some bad math being done there on our historical concepts. Back to the United States. So indigenous communities were put through this, that we took their land. We didn't provide them citizenship rights, which in our community, I feel we understand the impact of that, not having citizenship rights. So they didn't get citizenship rights in their own country, in their own lands, and they didn't get voting rights until 1962. A country founded on religious freedom did not allow indigenous communities to practice their religions until 1970s. So that's a huge impact. And in working with the indigenous communities, and I really do believe you should go to Tulalip tribes. They have the Hibbalb Center and a lot of presentations and cultural. Their resilience is amazing. And the push that we're seeing now in this younger generation to re-indigenize themselves and align themselves and learn their indigenous community, for me, has been really inspiring, because again, I'm indigenous, but I just can't reclaim my language, but I do try to reclaim my indigeneity in other ways. This brings us to our Black and African American experience, which again, I'm trying to consolidate hundreds of years into 5 minutes. So the biggest thing that I always like to point out is, despite what you hear, research has shown that slavery that occurred from 1619 on was called chattel slavery. And the reason it was called chattel slavery, it was different than any other slavery found before. Never before had we commercialized humans as a product. And we did so in mass quantities. We treated it like a trade commerce, right? And that is why it's very different from any other type of slavery. It caused great harm. And in order to be able to enslave a human, you have to do a lot of harm. And again, that dehumanization of this person and being able to treat them as poorly as you can think of, right? Physical, mental, and sexual abuse was perpetuated on this community for the longest time ever. Then in 1865, we eliminated slavery and we said, okay, people can't be enslaved, blah, 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 blah. But we never, neither for the indigenous communities or any other community since before, we've never addressed how we dehumanize people and what small and little ways in society we've built off of that. And so it's no surprise that, you know, in the 1900s, you have a surge of the Ku Klux Klan and you have white people policing Black people, which is leading to lynchings. And the way that I like to explain how enculturated it was into our culture is another popular thing that occurred in that time was pictures. So people would take Black and white photos and make them into postcards. And one of the creepier traditions that came out of that is people would actually take pictures of lynchings and send those and say, like, here's the lynching you missed. And some of those pictures included children as young as 5 years old standing next to the dead body of a person who was hanging from a tree. So again, picture a 5-year-old in your life or yourself at 5 years old. What would it take for you to normalize standing next to a dead body that has been obviously physically harmed in unimaginable ways and then proceed to eat your lunch? The cultural impact of that is what we want to really focus on, which is why we still have policing of Black people today, which is why we have a high rate of harm from police officers and other authority figures. And in education, I really try to, like, not say it, but the impact of what is white women's roles in education towards our students of color, and how does that model the same policing behavior we see of white women in other contexts, right? And all of this is, again, something that we as a nation have not addressed, something that we don't, if we don't do culturally responsive practices, if we don't teach about this historical things in society, we are ingraining these beliefs in our students and in our children, because if you don't actively push against a dominant narrative, the dominant narrative will small and little and big ways push its narrative forward. And I mean, I could talk about that in 100 different ways, but that's the context of which I want us to understand bias. And the same thing for our Black and African American community. The way that they have shown resilience past everything that's done, that is what should be celebrated. And we, for both communities and every community, bringing into contextualize everything on a contemporary level, and not, you have to understand history to not repeat it, but we need to work on ourselves currently and what we can impact today. All right, biases. So what I'm going to show you next is a video. We really like to share it because it's pretty great representation of biases. So let's see here. Ready?
This is a man named Bob Rosenthal, and early in his career as a research psychologist, he did something very devious. Late one night, Bob secretly crept into his lab and he hung signs on all of the rat cages. Some of the signs said that the rat in the cage was incredibly smart, and some of the signs said that the rat in the cage was incredibly dumb, even though neither of these things was true. So then Bob brings this group of experimenters into his lab and says, for the next week, some of you are going to get these very smart rats and some these very dumb rats. And your job is to run your rat through a maze and record how well it does. So what did they find? it was not even close. The smart rats did almost twice as well as the dumb rats. Even though the smart rats were not smart and the stupid rats were not stupid. They were just all the same kind of average North Dakotan rat.
That almost to me sounds like the stuff of science fiction, like telekinesis.
Yeah, no one really believed him at first.
I was having trouble publishing any of this.
But what Bob eventually figured out was that the expectations that the experimenters had in their head actually translated into a whole set of tiny behavior changes.
Handling rats and handling them more gently can actually increase the performance of rats.
This kind of dynamic happens in people too.
You may be standing farther away from someone you have lower expectations for. You may not be making as much eye contact. And it's not something you can put your finger on.
That's Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford. She was one of several researchers who explained all kinds of surprising things that expectations can influence, like teacher expectations can raise or lower a student's IQ score. A mother's expectations can affect the drinking behavior of her middle schooler. Military trainers' expectations can literally make a soldier faster or slower.
Think about that. As you go through the world, the expectations of other people are constantly acting on you, literally making you stronger or weaker, smarter or dumber, faster or slower.
Yeah. So my question was, how far does this go? So Carol, for example, if I expect that if somebody jumps off a building, they will be able to fly, that's not going to work out so well, right?
Right.
So what does science know about where we should draw the line?
That line is moving. As we come to understand things that are possible and mechanisms through which a belief affects an outcome or one person affects another person, that line can move.
Okay, give me just a second here. Okay, so we are ready for breakout rooms. If somebody help me with that. In the chat, I'm putting the discussion questions that I want you all to talk about. Try to practice introducing yourself, sharing your name, your pronouns, and an identifier, whether that's the college you're going to or where you live, whatever it is you choose to share. I wanna give an opportunity for a few people to share. So if I could get a few volunteers, otherwise I'm an educator, so I'm happy to do voluntold.
I can go ahead and talk about what our group said. So for the first question, let me actually pull up the first question. Or how does our bias affect other people? We said, like, in our own experience, it could restrict opportunities or positive experiences we could have with those people. One example I offered is when you come from, like, say, a Black and brown community, growing up with kind of like a fear or bias against, like, white people because of the power imbalance in America's society. You kind of are, like, not as friendly, or I feel like you grow up kind of with a fear of them. And when you go out into the world with that bias, you could be restricting opportunities, say, if you didn't go out of your way to communicate with Americans, or even positive experiences if you aren't friendly with a certain demographic. And then for our second one, how does it by implicit racial bias affect us? We said, well, in the way that other people perceive us. I know one that Rosario mentioned is when oftentimes Latinos from different countries are lumped together. People from Peru are assumed to, or Honduras are assumed to be Mexican, and they all celebrate, or that we all celebrate Cinco de Mayo. And not only is it's not, I'm sure a lot of people aren't too sensitive to that, but at times it could be harmful to see that a lot of people don't care to notice the differences between every culture and how unique each culture is to us.
Thank you so much for sharing. Those are great conversations. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I'll share.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think for me is like that internal bias, and like for me it wasn't just racism. It was feeling shunned out from my own community. I'm a former gang member and I'm formerly incarcerated. I'm home from doing 10 years in prison, 6 of those 10 years solitary confinement, you know, and now I do the work of helping those coming home from prison, but most importantly helping our youth and our people get out of gangs. And so there's that like sense of, where do I belong in the community? Do I even belong in the community? And so like my reason for joining Latino leadership was to grow that connection and become closer with my people.
That's awesome. That's an amazing reflection, and I see that, right? And so, I am terrible at condensing what I want to teach. And so I obviously overplanned. So what I'm going to leave you with is hopefully the willingness to have conversations with each other's or those around you. I'm also in the chat. I'm going to put a link to a Google form. It does take your email, but that's so that you get the results back, because it's called so I don't know how many of you have ever done a privilege bead activity. We've tried it in the district. We found a lot of different things about it. And so what we did is we took that activity and we made it into a Google form that someone can take on their own. And then it emails them the results so that then you can reflect on it. Because the one thing we didn't get to dive into is kind of what some of your conversations brought up, is that intersectionality, right? We develop biases upon all of our identities. So it's not just, oh, good, thanks. Somebody let me know I need to fix it. So let me do that while it's not just our racial identity, but it's our gender, everything. Here you go. It should be fixed now. So everything that we are creates a bias, right? I might be more excited to meet someone from Peru because I'm from Peru, so I'm like automatically like, oh, I know you, right? Or I know where you're from. So this activity kind of takes some of the main privileges that sometimes we don't think about, like ability. What is the privilege of citizenship versus non-citizenship, right? Like those are things that impact day to day. And we sometimes miss. So I do encourage you to take that survey and kind of think that through. That would hopefully then give you some things that you would want to work on. Because as Nevaeh mentioned, the only way in which you're going to undo your unconscious biases is by learning and spending time with other communities. Because you basically have to be in those situations and unlearn those reactions and be conscious of yourself while you're in those moments to undo them, right? And it's daily work, and it's also being open to feedback, because you can be a person of color, you can have experienced racism and microaggressions, but you are still completely capable of doing them yourselves. And so you need to be open and work on listening when someone tells you that something you've said has hurt them, or something that you're doing is communicating something you aren't maybe intending to communicate. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I'll finish building out the slides with those slides that I had to bring in, and then I'll share it with I think at least Rosario. I don't care. There was someone else who emailed me, but
Sarina is the
Sarina.
one coordinating all the materials.
So I'm
Thank you so
done.
much.
You're welcome. Thank you.